Welcome to The Rational Mind, and today we're looking at sexual ethics, which is chapter 3.2 in the OCR A-Level Religious Studies specification. So firstly, as always, have a look at the key terms, pause the video and see whether you can define them before I go through them. So consent. This is freely agreeing to engage in sexual activity with another person. Homosexuality is sexual attraction between people of the same sex. Premarital sex is sex before marriage. Extramarital sex is sex between the confines of marriage, so usually used to describe adulterous sex. So, cohabitation is an unmarried couple living together in a sexually active relationship, and sometimes this is known prerogatively as living in sin by some traditional Christian and religious people. Exclusive is a commitment to be in a sexual relationship with a person to the exclusion of all others. So you're fully committed to each other. And this is the opposite of an open marriage or a casual relationship, because you only have sex with each other and you're fully committed to each other. And betrothal, this is a really traditional, old-fashioned medieval concept, let's say. And it's the traditional exchange of promises to marry, which historically marked the point at which sex was permitted. And this was way stronger than the modern day proposal. Once you were betrothed, you were kind of already married in a way. And consummation was an act of sexual intercourse that indicates in some traditional the finalization of the marriage, because this is when a married couple has sex. So, firstly, into what is premarital sex. So, premarital sex refers to sex before marriage, as we said, and it might mean sex between two people who are planning to marry each other, or it might just mean having sexual relationships whilst being a single person. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be fully committed to the person. It might be more of a casual thing. And premarital sex has become much more common since the introduction of reliable contraception, and is more obviously of a modern concept. And having children without being married has also become increasingly common in the UK and socially acceptable, as in the olden days, a lot of the time, well, not even that old, even in the 60s, let's say, women who had babies and weren't married were really looked down upon in society. But now it's becoming more and more common for couples to have children before even getting married or without getting married at all. So, cohabitation is used to refer to couples who live together before getting married, but today many cohabitating couples have no intention of getting married. And people bring up children together without feeling it necessary to get married. A lot of people in the modern day society see marriage as a societal construct and don't need a piece of paper in order to get married, as a lot of people see like a divorces 50% of marriages end in divorce nowadays, so a lot of people don't really see the point of getting married. But traditional Christian teaching is that sex before marriage is a sin, and sex should be for a couple who are committed to each other in a marriage partnership. So sex before marriage can be seen as undermining Christian marriage and demonstrating a lack of moral discipline. And a lot of the time this is because a couple is seen to, or people are using each other for pleasure and not really getting to know each other, especially if it's a one-night stand situation or just casual sex. And this is why Christians don't really agree with this concept. And Christians might refer to Genesis 2:24 to support their views. So this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And this quote can be seen in two ways. The most traditional way of reading this biblical quote is that it's a man leaving his mother and father to be with a wife. So again, it's traditionally showing that a marriage is between a man and woman, and they become one. So they physically become one, as in they have sex, but they also become one in procreating and having a child. So this is what it's illustrating for traditional marriage to be in Genesis. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church argues that premarital sex does not support Christian ideas about fidelity, exclusivity, and commitment, and is seen as a sin. But obviously, not all Catholics agree with this. So, just some advice in essays: never write all Catholics. Just put some or most, because there are very liberal Catholics that don't agree with this. The same with Church of England. But some leaders of the Church of England accept that living together before marriage can be a step along the way to a marriage commitment, but others oppose it and insist on marriage as the proper context of a sexual relationship. And Adrian Thatcher, in Marriage After Modernity, Christian Marriage in Postmodern Times 1999, points out the long tradition of betrothal as the key point of commitment rather than the marriage ceremony, and traditionally sexual relationships were permitted after betrothal, but betrothal was considered seriously binding, unlike modern cohabitation. So again, in, let's say, medieval times when this was quite prominent, was if a man and a woman or any couple was seen as even kissing, they had to get married because they physically were touched, and she would be seen as belonging to a man, and they kind of had to already be together, and them separating would be really humiliating for the woman, and she would probably never be betrothed again. And in Christianity, there are different points of view, from those who think that cohabitating couples should be excluded from the church, to those who think that all forms of committed loving relationships should be encouraged. And again, this really depends on your own personal beliefs as well as traditional church beliefs. Fundamentalist Christians would see it as you can't live together, especially if you're not married, and have sex. But again, in modern day, like Christians in the UK would be very different, more liberal. So moving on to extramarital sex. Extramarital sex refers to sexual relationships where one or both of the sexual partners is married to someone else. So when people are cheating on their partners, basically, and committing adultery. And Christian teaching is firmly against adultery. As you can see, it's forbidden in the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not commit adultery. And the Catholic Church teaches that sex is exclusively for married couples. And because the Catholic Church does not recognise divorce, it considers anyone entering a new sexual relationship after separation or divorce is having extramarital sex. Because when you get married, it's a commitment and a covenant made between you and your partner and God. So therefore, the only thing that can break that covenant is death. Till death do us part is the marriage vow that's taken. So the only thing that can break that is death, as I just said, or if you have an annulment. An annulment is when the Pope grants separation and it's as if the marriage never actually happened. But these are very rare. The most famous case that I always show is Britney Spears, who got married in Vegas for 72 hours and they had annulment because she was drunk, intoxicated, she didn't know what she was doing. So you either have to be not of sound mind, you were forced into the marriage and didn't consent, or you would have found out that they maybe couldn't have children, or they lied to you and they were completely someone different. Those are really the only conditions that would possibly let you grant having an annulment by the Pope. Or divorce, obviously, in everyday other settings. But you wouldn't be able to be married in the church again because you're already married in the eyes of God. So Christianity's stance against divorce probably developed as a way of protecting women against being used as bargaining tools, because a lot of time women, traditionally, the father had to pay a dowry on whoever married their daughter so that they would get paid. So again, at the time it's a lot of inequalities here. So till death do us part in sickness and in health are marriage vows that you can refer to. So you have to be there for the person, whether they're healthy or they're sick, until they die. But there is also a Christian teaching that supports divorce, and it's mostly in the Old Testament. So a lot of Jews can use this as well to divorce their wives. And it's wives, do not divorce your husbands. Husbands, do not divorce your wives. But if you want to divorce your wives, grant her a certificate of divorce. So it basically says that women can't divorce their husbands, but if husbands want to divorce their wives, then they have to provide her a certificate of divorce. And some Jewish denominations still follow this, and women can't divorce their husbands, but husbands can divorce their wives. So this is an argument you can use in order to support divorce from a Christian teaching perspective. And consent is also seen as an issue in sexual relationships in the modern world. So now we're going to look into the ethical approaches of premarital and extramarital sex, with all the different ethical theories that we've been looking into. So firstly, natural moral law. And if you haven't watched my natural moral law video, take a look at that first so you can get a reminder of what natural moral law is. So followers of natural moral law take an absolutist view of ethics. So if you remember what absolutism means, it means that there is a direct yes or no, a direct right or wrong for all ethics. In natural law, ethics is linked to an understanding of human nature as having a purpose, and people should do those things that allow them to flourish and reach their potential. Because remember, Aquinas developed this theory, as you can see him on the right here. He developed Aristotle's thinking of eudaimonia and becoming the best human being that you could possibly be. And he thought that was by following God's natural laws that we can see and observe throughout the world, which were the primary precepts. So Catholic teaching relies heavily on natural law. And in natural law, reproduction is one of the primary precepts. And this is interpreted to mean that reproduction should be considered as the main aim of sexual activity, and this is what Aquinas thought. So Aquinas thought sex was only for married couples to have children. And this is why the Catholic Church stances on this are so leaning towards that direction. Obviously not all Catholics, but just traditional church teachings, as we saw earlier. So premarital and extramarital sex are wrong in the eyes of natural moral law, because they are inconsistent with the flourishing of human society in bringing up children in stable families. So it goes over the precepts of reproduction, of extramarital sex and premarital sex, and especially using contraception. And it goes against living in an ordered society, because Aquinas believed that a nuclear family, so 2 kids and their mum and dad, should be living together. So the use of artificial methods of contraception is also prohibited by the Catholic Church, but not most of the denominations, and we'll go into this later. The natural law could be seen as a good approach to ethics of premarital sex and extramarital sex, as it can give clear rules rather than leaving people to make decisions in the heat of the moment. And it emphasises the importance and the sanctity of marriage and of reproduction, which could be seen as beneficial for the stability of society and in line with Christian principles. Also, obviously, there are also a lot of bad things, and one of the biggest challenges or downfalls of natural moral law is it doesn't allow for artificial contraception being used. And we'll go over some of the other approaches towards homosexuality as well later. But say a couple wasn't ready to have a child, this would force a woman to have a baby, and it would take away her autonomy to choose whether to keep it or not. What if a woman is raped and she falls pregnant? She's not allowed to get rid of the baby according to natural moral law. Obviously that can cause a lot of psychological damage and trauma towards a survivor of rape. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges there that are posed. And then we're moving on to situation ethics with Joseph Fletcher here on my right. So followers of situation ethics do not think that there should be rules guiding premarital or extramarital sex. And again, if you haven't seen my situation ethics video, I would recommend you having a look at that first before we go into this further. So situation ethics said that each situation needs to be considered in the context of its own circumstances, because it is a consequentialist theory. So it looks at the outcomes over the actions. And the most loving course of action should be determined and followed, because situation ethics obviously looks at agape love in a lot of detail. So it presents a relativist view of morality, so it's not absolute, it depends on the outcomes, and the actions being right or wrong can change depending on the situation. So Fletcher uses issues of sexual ethics to illustrate his view that there should be absolute rules. with examples of having a woman having sex with a prison guard in order to secure her freedom. So this is the example of Mrs. Bergermeyer. She was in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany, and the only way for her to leave and be released is if she had a baby or if a woman was pregnant. So she had sex with the prison guard in order to get pregnant so that she could get back to her husband and her fat kids. And she actually ended up bringing the child up as her own, and her husband loved the child just as much, but it was the only way for her to get out of the concentration camp. Fletcher also gives an example of a spy having sex with the enemy in order to bring about the end of a war. So again, it's using agape love as a greater means here. So adultery or premarital sex is seen as acceptable in these certain situations. But the criticism of situation ethics is that Fletcher only gives really extreme examples that most people won't come to terms with or will never really have to face. Hopefully most people will never end up in a concentration camp, and so will never really see whether they have to commit adultery in order to leave. So maybe if he gave more realistic and more everyday examples, his thinking could be more relatable to the everyday person, because it really stretches the line of, well, when is the greatest love? When's agape love really used? And then we have Kantian ethics, and again with Kant here on my right, so have a look at my Kantian ethics video before, if you want, before we get in further. So followers of Kant take also an absolutist view of ethics based on ideas of duty as the categorical imperative. So as if you remember, the categorical imperative looks at three main concepts. It has to be universalizable, it has to treat people as ends in themselves and not as means to an end, and it has to be as if we're living in a perfect kingdom of ends. So people should not treat each other as means to an end, like I said, which rules out exploitative and non-consensual sexual relationships, because you're using someone for your own advantage and not seeing them as their own autonomous rational beings. Kant was all about recognizing people's rational autonomy and not exploiting it but respecting it. And in the kingdom of ends, the commitment of marriage would be respected. And universalizability would prevent so much sexual freedom that society was undermined, but it would probably condone premarital sex in loving relationships, but probably not in casual relationships where you're both using each other as a means of just sex rather than loving each other for who that person is. So Kant emphasised the importance of promise keeping also and truth telling. So again, suggest secretive extramarital sex will be really unethical because you're lying, you're using someone as a means to an end, it's not universalizable, and it's not an ideology that would work in the perfect kingdom of ends. Some criticisms of in ethics, however, could be that it's too legalistic, but I personally think that it has less challenges than the other two forms of ethics. It might not take into account really extreme situations, and it doesn't take into account conflicting duties. The axe murderer example is a really good example there of conflicting duties that you can then apply to sexual ethics. And then utilitarianism with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill with act utilitarianism and raw utility. So Mill argued that people should be protected from unnecessary legislation and should be free to behave how they wish unless it causes harm to others, and this was through his harm principle. So again, look into my utilitarianism video if you want to get more of a reminder of what they say in more detail. And this principle could be used by utilitarians to justify premarital sex, extramarital sex, and homosexuality. Although opponents might argue that these principles do cause harm because they undermine the seriousness of a heterosexual marriage commitment. But Bentham and Mill were not Christian themselves, they were atheist. So I don't think they would really traditionally care about it in terms of because utilitarianism is all about greatest happiness for the greatest number, I think if it's not causing pain or suffering, then I don't think they would see it as an issue. So, for example, if someone's cheating and keeping it a secret, then that probably isn't causing greatest happiness for the greatest number. And, well, I mean, if someone doesn't find out, then maybe it does. But if someone finds out, then it doesn't. So maybe they would condone more of an open relationship where you're communicative and not secret between what you're doing in a relationship with your partner. So maybe they would allow an open relationship that's honest, but not one that's secretive, possibly. But Mill, in The Subjugation of Women, he argued that marriage can sometimes reduce women to the status of slaves. So he was not against marriage, but he was really in favour of gender equality. And Mill tried to make contraception available to the poor at times when the Christian Church opposed artificial contraception. So again, there's a lot of positive here in terms of allowing women their own bodily autonomy here. The criticism you could say here is with ACT utilitarianism, because it would probably condone things like rape if it causes greatest happiness for the greatest number. So it might condone things like gangbangs, which obviously just feels very ethically wrong. And this is where Mill's rule utilitarianism would then not condone it because of the harm principle. So that possibly is a stronger aspect of utilitarianism. ACT utilitarianism has a lot of problems with human rights violations because it looks at greatest majority happiness and it doesn't defend minority rights. And now moving on to homosexuality and the ethics on homosexuality. So, as we know, it's a term used to describe sexual attraction between people of the same sex. And attributes towards homosexuality have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. And in the first half of the 20th century, homosexuality was a crime. And it was decriminalised in England and Wales in 1967. And the first same-sex marriage took place in England and Wales in 2014. So not that long ago, just over 10 years, if you're watching this in 2025. A really interesting example that you can give for homosexuality being criminalised is the case of Alan Turing. So he was one of the scientists during World War II that helped build the machine that cracked the Enigma code, that helped to defeat the Nazis, obviously. So you can see he was a very intelligent man that really helped to, or was an instrument in coming about with the end of the Second World War. And yet, when he was found to be gay, was imprisoned. And he was given the option of staying in prison or going through conversion therapy. And he chose to go through conversion therapy, obviously, like most people probably would, rather than being in prison. And he ended up poisoning himself because of how depressed he was. So again, it really shows the really cruel aspects of law and how just because something's law doesn't mean that it is ethically right. And you can kind of see the evolution of the portrayal and acceptance of homosexuality here. And people disagree about homosexuality still nowadays, and there are many instances of anti-homosexual acts and discrimination, but also many instances of public acceptance and celebration of homosexual relationships. And Pride is a really big celebration of that in June. So, traditionally, Christianity has opposed homosexuality as sinful. And some texts in the Bible condemn homosexual acts. So, for example, do not have sexual relationships with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable in Leviticus. Or there's also the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. And there is disagreement about what these texts mean and whether they should be considered to be applicable and enforceable in the present day, especially as many Old Testament rules are disagreed by Christians and are no longer relevant. The other really interesting aspect is the Bible was traditionally written in Greek, and in the Greek translation or the Greek version, homosexuality is never actually mentioned. So therefore, translations could be an issue, and just how society and adapted its own reflections onto the Bible. So that could also be another point that you could mention here. But homosexuality as an issue causes deep divisions between Christian churches around the world, and they continue to have a lot of debates. The Anglican Communion struggles to reach agreement about same-sex marriages in the church and about the appointment of an openly gay clergy. And some churches, such as Methodists and the URC, welcome homosexual partners into church life. So traditionally, the Catholic Church doesn't allow homosexual or gay couples to have a marriage within the church, but they will give a blessing to the couple. Some Church of England churches allow gay marriages. But again, it really depends on individual perspectives as well. It's not all Catholics, it's not all Anglicans. Again, most fundamentalists reject homosexuality as well. But again, just be careful with the wording, because it's not all Christians that are against or for. There's a lot of different opinions. So again, if we look at the different ethical approaches within different... Firstly, with natural moral law. So natural law ethics sees homosexual acts as wrong because they cannot bring forth new life, so they go against the precept of reproduction, and it's seen in the telos of human sexuality. As I said, the Catholic Church traditionally sees homosexuality as a sin, but in modern times, some Catholics take a more liberal view of homosexuality. And Pope Francis stated in 2016 that there was no grounds for considering a same-sex couple partnership similar to God's plans for marriage and family life. And some people criticise natural law approaches to homosexuality because plenty of sexual relationships do not and cannot bring forth new life. So for example, an older married couple who the woman might have gone through menopause, she can't have a child. Or a couple that has fertility issues, they also can't have children. So how is that different from a homosexual couple not being able to have children? And also with modern day science, homosexual couples can have children with IVF. But again, natural moral law wouldn't agree with IVF through a heterosexual couple either. So that's why possibly they would still be against, or the theory would still be against it. Situation ethics concentrates on finding the most loving outcome. So it does not give rules about homosexuality in general, but it would consider a homosexual relationship to be morally acceptable if it brought about agapeic love. And it might be difficult to apply to issues of homosexuality if the needs of other people as well as the needs of the couple are considered, but most would agree that it is unloving to forbid homosexual relationships and loving to support them. And Kantian ethics, as it is deontological, placing duty and autonomy at the heart of moral decision making, and is used to formulate rules governing sexual behaviour. So applying Kantian principles to issues of homosexuality does not lead to one clear answer, but it could be used to justify a range of different attitudes. So because Kantian ethics argues that you need to treat everyone as means with themselves with dignity, then homosexual relationships should be regarded as equal to heterosexual relationships. So technically, even though Kant doesn't actually say this, it does condone homosexual relationships and supports them, because as long as a partner is being respected and they're both in a loving, committed relationships, and they're not using each other as a means to an end. So they wouldn't agree with casual homosexual relationships, just as Kantian ethics wouldn't agree with heterosexual sexual relationships. But as long as you have a loving, compassionate relationship, it doesn't matter whether it's homosexual or heterosexual. It would argue on the principle of universalizability, meaning that everyone should have the right to express their sexuality in a relationship. Again, this might not be what Kant specifically meant, but he never actually included that homosexuality was wrong. So therefore it doesn't, I mean, if he really didn't agree with it, he would have mentioned. So, and maybe in an essay, don't write Kant would support, just write Kantian ethics would support, just to be very clear that you're not saying Kant definitely would say yes, because we don't know. But Kantian ethics does emphasise mutual consent and avoiding exploitation, and these principles would underpin relationships regardless of the sexuality of the partners. And with utilitarianism, it looks for moral actions that will bring about the greatest happiness and cause least harm, as we saw. So many utilitarians would agree that homosexual relationships cause happiness to those in them and not harm anyone else. And some argue that homosexual relationships do harm the rest of society because they undermine marriage as a stable societal institution. So again, it would depend on the situation. So utilitarianism probably wouldn't be as open-minded, especially rule act utilitarianism. It might again go on majority principle, but rule utilitarianism would support homosexual relationships a lot more, especially because of the harm principle is if it's not harming anyone else. And most utilitarians reject the idea for rules about private behaviour between consenting adults, so if they cause no harm to others, as I said. So that's all. So this is all your AO1 knowledge. So you can pause the video and see whether you can answer these questions, and if you can, then you know all your AO1 knowledge for this topic. Now it's time for some exam practice, because practice makes perfect. To what extent are natural law ethics helpful in guiding decisions about sexual relationships and sexual behaviour? So within this essay, you want to demonstrate knowledge and understanding through the use of some of the following ideas. This isn't a list that's going to be, this list isn't restricted to this. You can open it up to more, but these are just suggestions. So description and explanation of the main principles and key features of natural moral law, so including the thinking of Aquinas and the primary precepts and the secondary precepts. Then you can describe and explain the influence of natural law ethics on the teachings of the Catholic Church in relation to issues of sexual relationships. Then describe and explain the views of thinkers who support or criticise natural law ethics in relation to sexual behaviour. You can point at other ethical theories here as well. You can describe and explain an alternative ethical system offering different approaches to sexual ethics. So maybe you might think utilitarianism is better, or Kantian ethics, or situation ethics, and you can argue for that as a better, more helpful way of guiding decisions about sexual relationships. With the AO2 content, you have to demonstrate skills in critical evaluation, analysis, and coherent argument through the use of some of the following things. So you might agree with natural moral law, so you can say that they give firm, clear guidelines which are easy to understand and don't need interpretation in order to apply them. They are based on biblical teachings and have the support of statements from the Catholic Church to show their relevance to the present day. So again, use biblical quotes here. Catholic teachings. The reasoning behind natural law rules about sexual behaviour is easy to follow as well. And then arguments to disagree with natural moral law is, some argue that people cannot choose their sexuality, and it's unfair to condemn people for wanting sexual relationships to prevent them from having any if they are homosexual. Natural law ethics might seem to be inconsistent with logic, as people who are past the menopause or for other reasons infertile are not prohibited from having sex within a marriage. Some argue that ethical systems are unnecessary in private relationships and are only needed for issues which involve wider society, and other ethical systems are more helpful and appropriate for the modern day than natural moral law, and you can give examples, and then you can give a conclusion at the end, and remember an introduction at the beginning. And then with this question, how far might utilitarianism provide useful guidelines and discussions about the sexual ethics of homosexuality? So again, open up with an introduction, and then you might demonstrate knowledge and understanding through the use of some of the following ideas. Again, it's not restricted to this, you can open it up more, this is just some ideas. So description and explanation of utilitarian, key features and principles, including the hedonic calculus and the principle of utility. You might want to make a distinction between act and rule utilitarianism and preference. Description and explanation of different variants of utilitarian thought, such as act and rule utilitarianism with reference to different thinkers. You might want to describe and explain issues surrounding homosexuality, such as whether homosexuality should be considered criminal, and issues of same-sex marriage as well. Then you want to look into your AO2 content. So with arguing that utilitarianism does provide useful guidelines, you might want to say that utility recognises that legalisation should be kept to a minimum. It emphasises maximising pleasure and avoiding pain, and this is good rule for sexual relationships, allowing freedom for people to express their sexuality as long as no one else is harmed. So for example, it won't rule out like kinks either. So for example, like BDSM, as long as people are consenting and it brings pleasure, as well as homosexual relations or premarital or extramarital sex. It avoids involving religious rules that predicate reliable contraception and prevention of sexually transmitted diseases. It recognises personal autonomy, and it treats everyone's interests as equal, so that happiness of a homosexual couple is given the same respect and consideration as a heterosexual couple. And then you might want to say that it doesn't provide the best guidelines. Here you can say it ignores the telos of sexual relationships as primary, being for a production of children, so what natural moral law says. It regards the sanctity of heterosexual relationships and the sanctity of marriage. It is concerned with pleasure rather than the agapeic love or the will of God. So again, you can agree with situation ethics or natural moral law here. And it can be used to justify all kinds of behaviour by the end of results. So when some behaviours are just intrinsically wrong. You can then maybe say you think Kantian ethics might be better. So you might go into Kantian ethics and see why it would be better. And you can, throughout this particular example, you would have to use homosexuality as an example throughout. And you can give different examples of homosexuality. So you can give ones where people are just in a casual relationship, one where there's extramarital sex happening, or one where there's a loving, compassionate relationship between a couple, homosexual couple. And there might be differences there that you might want to explore within different theories, and then give a conclusion at the end. So that's all for today. Thank you for joining me on this revision session on sexual ethics, and join me next time for more religious studies, philosophy and ethics.